Boardroom Bound, Episode 69, Connecting Ideas, Strategy, and People with Helga Svendsen.
A lot of the time people know intellectually maybe that diversity is a good thing, but it's having a board that has in place processes and the values and the right team of people that can really manage that tension in the boardroom, because diversity brings tension.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're going all the way to Australia to speak to Helga Svendsen. She is someone who coaches people through landing their board seat. She has several programs that teach people through. The first program is about how you land the seat. The second program is how you be successful once you're in that board role and perhaps expanded into a portfolio of board opportunities. And she is someone who's also had a non-executive director career herself, sits on several boards as it is, and brings that lessons learned and best practices also into the coaching that she does. And of course, all with a great Australian accent, which is good fun for all of us. I don't have enough people from down under on the show. I must correct that. So let's jump into the show. Helga Svendsen, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you, Alexander. It is fantastic to be here. Having been a fan of your show, it is fabulous to be behind the mic and having a chat to you today.
Well, you are. We have had less than a handful of people from Australia on the show yet, but I do love how the world is so connected. It's so easy for us to be here and sharing best practice advice on this topic that you and I both love. We're going to dig into that, but it's a passion project for both of us because you also have a great podcast, Take on Board podcast, covering very similar things. So I know that we're going to talk a lot today about the same stuff that you and I have been hearing from our great guests. Excited to hear about that. But you don't just host the show, you also do this for yourself professionally, and you enjoy it. Let's start out, if you could tell a bit of our audience about some of your career background, how you became to be a NED expert and have a portfolio of board roles yourself.
Absolutely. So like many careers, I feel like it's been a bit of a winding road. It's often not a straight road to where you are today. And if you'd asked me as a younger person, where do you think you'll be in, a couple of decades' time? I'm not sure I would have answered, I'll be running my own consultancy and having my own board portfolio. But here I am, and if I look back over it, it does actually make a bit of sense that that's where I've ended up. So my professional career background, I'm a lawyer by trade. So I started out as a lawyer doing personal injuries litigation, a little bit of family law, so doing some law. And then I pivoted, into the union movement. So I was at a couple of different unions and over, about 15 years altogether, and ended up as Assistant Secretary of one of the Australian unions, the Australian Services Union in Victoria. So that taught me an awful lot about influence, around negotiation, about working with groups of people and all sorts of things. From there, I moved into the Victorian government, our local state government, working in sustainability. So I was at Sustainability Victoria, and I had this fabulous role where I was almost like an internal consultant. The title was, Facilitator of Strategic Opportunities, but I got to work with a whole range of different parts of the organisation. When a new program had been announced or a program needed a bit of support, I would just zip in, give some support, and then move out again and hand it back to the organisation. So it gave me a really broad mix of connections and expertise across that area as well. I then pivoted again. So when I left there, I moved into the not-for-profit sector. So I was the CEO of one of our local asylum seeker agencies, providing housing and casework support for people seeking asylum, and was there for a couple of years. And I often describe that time as, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I've had some pretty difficult jobs in my time, and that was probably the most challenging, but also possibly the most satisfying role as well. So it was just, an incredible opportunity to work with people, both the staff who were incredibly passionate and committed to what they did, and also our clients that we supported who had been through some incredibly difficult times, and being able to provide them with that support was an honour. When I left there, so we merged that organisation. We merged with a different organisation, and which we desperately needed to do, like lots of not-for-profits. Our back end was pretty thin, and merging was one of the ways for making us sustainable. And when we merged, two CEOs, I was the CEO of the smaller agency, and I thought to myself, I think I know how this story ends. So exited stage left and just started doing my own consultancy, not intending to, but, ended up, people would just say, oh, could you just do this? Could you just do that? And here's where I landed. And I love what I do. I now I do consultancy, facilitating strategy and planning, governance reviews. I have some programs to support women on board. So I have a program called Board Kickstarter, which supports getting women on boards. I have a program called Board Accelerator, which supports women once they're on boards. And I, of course, have my podcast, the Take On Board podcast, similar to your one, Alexander, where we talk to women each week about some of the challenges they're experiencing about getting on a board.
And of course, the name is very clever, right? So it's basically you're going to discover what you need to take on board to be your best self in the boardroom. Is that the way it came about?
Absolutely. Okay. And I must say it took a little longer than I would have hoped to come up with the name. And I had some advice from a small group of people that helped me with it, which was fabulous. And running along in the background while all of this was happening in my professional career, I was also starting to build a board portfolio. So, and I think you've been on the YWCA board as well. Is that right?
Right. I'm one of the 30 largest in the U.S. here, which is just a wonderful organization doing great stuff.
Right. So that was my YWCA Victoria. Well, it wasn't my first board, but it was my first. I had been on one through my employment, but it was my first board that I picked up as my own board, I guess. And it was when I was leaving the union movement, and I thought, we had done a lot of work in the not-for-profit sector and the community sector. I was moving into state government, and I thought, I want to really keep this connection to the community sector. So I started looking around for a board, and the YWCA caught my eye as a fabulous organisation, a feminist organisation delivering amazing support and services to the women of Victoria. So I applied for their board and was very fortunate to join their board. So I was on the board of YWCA Victoria for a number of years, for our maximum term, which is 6 years. Also on our subsidiary of YWCA, which was Social Housing Victoria, providing housing to women in Victoria. And then just kind of built from that experience with YWCA into a couple of other board roles. So the Centre for Sustainability Leadership, where I was the chair of the board for a couple of years until we wound up. Not quite the legacy I thought that I would leave, but it's turned out to be a fabulous thing for the organisation and the legacy. And my current board portfolio is I'm a director on the Royal Women's Hospital here in Victoria, so one of the large tertiary hospitals for women in Victoria, and also the Accident Compensation Conciliation Service. So I feel like I'm returning, almost going back home to my personal injuries litigation career and making a contribution there that I joined that board late last year. So yeah, lots of things, and that's a bit of a potted history of how I got to where I am now.
And so let's bubble that up to the surface. So you've had several non-executive director roles, which we just abbreviate to NED roles in the U.S. If you're not familiar with that, as the term that most of the rest of the world will describe it, that we would just call board roles over here. And you've had several of those, and you've sort of taken that up to the 30,000-foot view where you now have sort of coaching and support programs, guidance, best practice for others. So your board Kickstarter group, for example, you talked about is helping women to get onto boards. And our audience, whether you're male or female, you're going to have a lot of the same ideas and thoughts and backgrounds. And I'm sure you run through an amazing curriculum of best practices that we would clearly not have time to cover in all of this episode today. But maybe we can just start at the high level. What are the different sort of subjects and topics that you're going to take the people through that are working that program with you?
Absolutely. So the framework that we work through in that program is essentially what I think the key elements are for a high-performing board. And that is, there's four things. You need the right skills on your board, and therefore for people looking for board roles, you need to be able to identify what are those governance skills that you can make a contribution to a board. So boards need it, and you need to package up your own skills in a way that will really add value and make that contribution. So that first part is around skills. The second part is being really clear about the commitment you are making. So knowing what is required of a board member, what responsibilities you are taking on as a board member, and the time that it takes. So I think sometimes there is this beautiful impression that, you can just have this board portfolio and go and play golf the rest of the time. And the reality is far from that. My rule of thumb is that any board role is probably around 15-ish hours, maybe a few more, maybe a few less, but about 15 hours a month for all the reading and going to events and doing all of those sorts of things. So we really take people through what are all the sorts of things that a board member might be asked to do and how long does that take. The next part is around alignment. And I think, and I've heard from guests that you've had on your show, and certainly people that I talk to here, it's the same. You've got to be passionate about the board that you're on. You really need to have that values alignment and vision alignment with the organisation. It's too big a role to do, if you're not passionate about what you do. So I take my group through a process to really start to identify your own key values and your own purpose, which will help make it easier for you to then identify what sort of boards you are looking for. And indeed, that what sort of boards you're looking for, I think, is key as well. I really encourage people to work out what they want rather than just snapping up what's out there. Find the board that they want and consciously make a choice and consciously put that organisation through the ropes in the recruitment process as well to make sure it's a good match. And the final part that I think is incredibly important for people looking for boards and for people when they're on boards is diversity. And it's the thing you and I talk about on our shows a lot, but ensuring that you are joining the board of an organisation and an organisation that really values diversity. Because I think a lot of the time people know kind of intellectually maybe that diversity is a good thing, but it's having a board that has in place processes and the values and the right team of people that can really manage that tension in the boardroom, because diversity brings tension. It's different views. It's part of the value of diversity is that it brings that tension. And you need a chair and a board and an organisation that can really manage that tension in a constructive way rather than in a way that sometimes might not be so helpful. So I take people through that framework, and then we do the nuts and bolts, putting together your board resume, putting together a pitch for a board and making sure you can really talk about what the value is that you will be adding. We do practice board interviews, all of those sorts of things, so people come out of that really ready to step into the fray for getting themselves on a board.
So I think that's a great overview, plus the nuts and bolts behind it about what it might look and feel like. And I think the reality for a lot of people, depending on where you are in the process, right? So if you're already a sitting C-suite executive, you might have a sense of the industry you're in or the expertise you bring. But if you're earlier in that cycle and you're thinking, this is something I want to do someday and I'm preparing for it, what I often hear from people is, I'd like to get a board role. And my reaction to that is like, that's wonderful, but I feel like you've just said to me, I want a job. And I don't know how to direct you and guide you and coach you down that way. You haven't said for-profit, nonprofit, large, public, private, small, whatever it might be. I imagine you probably have some people like that. How do you help someone who's maybe earlier in the process begin to think through that and to get a little bit more focused?
Yeah, great question. And indeed, it's often using that exact question, saying to people, great, so you want to pick up a board role, you want to start to develop that board portfolio. What sort of board are you looking for? And sometimes just asking that question is enough, I think, is it a not-for-profit board? Is it a government board? Is it a commercial board? Is it perhaps joining the committee of an organisation? What sort of industry is it in? Is it a women's organisation? Is it an environmental organisation? Is it a telecommunications organisation? And getting people to really think through those things, because it's not just joining a board, just like it's not just getting a job. You don't just go out and say, I'm going to get a job, pick a job, any job. You work out what the value is that you can add, and you work out the sort of industry or organisation that you want to work in, whether it's big, whether it's small, whether it's government, whether it's private sector. You do all of that for a job, and you need to do the same thinking for a board as well. It's not just some random, I'll just go and sit on a board and, it'll all come together. You really want to make some conscious choices about the industry, about the type of work it does, maybe about the size of the organisation, whether it's local or state or national, all of those sorts of things. So you've got a picture about what you're looking for.
And so let's take Jane Doe, who has gone through your program and she's learned all the stuff she needs to do, and she's out there and she's networking, she becomes successful and she lands her first board role. And then she might come back and join your board accelerator program. Talk us through, I'm going to call almost at level 2.0 of your education system of now they've got their first board seat. And for some people it might be, what did I get myself into and how do I be successful? But how do you talk them through bringing their best self to the boardroom? And maybe they want to expand it into a portfolio role after the first one.
Absolutely. So the Board Accelerator program was created exactly for this reason, because women were off getting boards and they're like, oh, okay, now we need some support. So having said that, it's a group of women that come together with a real range of experience. So it might be women who are just starting on their boards, or it might be those that have got quite significant experience. And that's part of the value of the program, is that it's a real range of women who participate in that. And what I do is I bring... Well, actually, I should say, if I can just take a step back, for Board Kickstarter and for Board Accelerator, one of the reasons I created the program is women used to come to me and say, oh, can I have a coffee? I want to talk about getting on a board. And I'd go and have a coffee. And then I'd have a coffee with Mary and with Jane and so on. And when I started running my own consultancy, I thought, well, hang on a minute. I think there's a better way I can do this. I think as women, potentially as people, we are stronger together. And bringing that group together so they can learn from me, but also from each other, is a much stronger way of doing it rather than individually. So that's why I created the program, because I was doing it individually, but I really wanted to bring that group together that could cheer squad each other into the roles and encourage each other and motivate each other and be accountable to each other. And likewise in the Board Accelerator program, it is a group program that I facilitate. And of course, I provide some of my expertise to that group, but it's really about drawing the group out. So we meet monthly. We have a different topic that we focus on each month, and the group sets their own topic. So it's an annual program, and every year the group might set different topics, but things like recruiting the CEO, or succession planning, or influence in the boardroom, or influence outside the boardroom, or staying in the strategic space, whatever it may be, those sorts of topics. And then each month, the participants will come, they will share something at their board that is working well in relation to whatever topic it is. They will share a resource around the topic. And then we spend half the session, one participant will bring a challenge to the table. And we spend 45 minutes or so really picking through that challenge, and I take them through a process where they present the challenge to the group and then we provide insights together around it. And of course, that is not just learning for the person who is bringing the challenge to the table, it is learning for the rest of the group as well around that particular topic. So it's a facilitator process where we can together learn and we can value everybody's information around the table.
Well, I think that's great. And I imagine that you're seeing a lot of these play out in your podcast as well. You probably do a bit of deep dives into some of the topics, and you hear people giving their best practice, but also lessons learned of, ooh, I wish I had known this back then, and I would have done this differently as lessons learned. And I know for a lot of our listeners, in some ways, that's the most valuable stuff, right? Because they're going, I don't need to reinvent the wheel. I can leverage what others have done. And I imagine, just to throw it out there as a starting point for this discussion, I'm sure what you often hear from people is they wish they'd put their hand up sooner. Is that right?
I think I hear a lot, oh, I just need to get the next role. I just need to get a bit more experience. I just need to. You don't just need to. People can make an opportunity on a board, I think, at any stage of their career. And indeed, if we're serious about diversity, we really need to start ensuring that younger women are also getting a place at the board table. So it's not waiting until later. It is putting your hand up as early as you can to really build that governance experience. Because if you want to build a governance portfolio, you need to start building that experience early. You can't just all of a sudden say, oh, I'm just going to pick up 3 paid board roles and that's going to be my career. You need to build some governance experience early for that. And there's different ways you can do that. You might be involved in a committee of a board. You might be involved in an advisory board. You might be on a board, and there's a number of organisations, YWCA is one, that has specific roles set aside for young women. So our board in Y Australia must have, actually, this was Y Victoria. I'm not sure if it applies to Y Australia, but for YWCA for Victoria, when I was on the board, we had to have 4 directors who were aged 30 years or under. We had to, a constitutional requirement. So I would say to women who are thinking about maybe building a board portfolio, or maybe just having a board role outside their own work to build different experience and be involved in different things, just do it. Put up your hand, get involved, do it now, don't wait.
And I know for some people, they view going down the nonprofit sector as a great way to get that first experience, to develop the stories they can share in the interviews. And clearly you can grow from, say, the mom and pop might be your first nonprofit up to something of a national name recognition like a YWCA. And then that sort of organization, something headhunters can really understand. That's a professional group. I understand the governance you went through. I can see how that's applicable. But for some people, there can still be a big jump from that into, say, a paid board role, whether it's a public or versus a private company. And I'm just going to guess that for some of your clients, that might be a bit of a sticking point. How do you guide people through what for some people feels like a giant gulf?
Yeah, look, I agree. I think building your governance experience through a not-for-profit board is a great way to start. Having said that, I really encourage my people to focus on a not-for-profit board that will give them that governance experience, because often in a smaller not-for-profit, you're quite hands-on in the role, and essentially you're a volunteer staff member often. And that's okay if what you're looking for is volunteer roles and doing that hands-on work. But if you're looking at building your governance experience, I encourage people to be a little bit picky about the roles that they pick up, even in the not-for-profit space, and choose a board or wait for the right board opportunity to come up with that matches what you are looking for, as well as the value that you can provide to that board. So look for a board that really has that strong governance structure and a history of governance perhaps, but also where they are focusing in the strategic space rather than the operational space, because that will give you the experience that you can then leverage into other roles. So, again, it's like I said before, I think people need to be picky. You need to really be clear about the value that you are adding and about the value you are looking for out of this role. And if it's governance experience, then make sure you're just joining a board that has that focus on governance. I often then advise people to think about maybe a government board might be the next step. And again, there are a whole range of different government boards, small through to large, and that might be a way of then taking the next step into the next level of governance, which might then be able to be leveraged into some of the bigger private sector boards. Having said that, sometimes people are not looking at some of the big private sector boards. So again, it's that working out what it is that you want to do and how you want to make the contribution and what sort of board it is. But basically just building that governance experience, getting the governance experience, whether it's in a not-for-profit or another organisation, and then owning that experience. In an interview, whether it's with a recruiter or with a board, you don't need to say, I've only been on the board of a not-for-profit. I've only done in unpaid roles. That is governance experience, and own it. I've been on the board of YWCA Victoria. As part of that role, I was, the chair of the investment committee. You don't need to soften it with those only or just. Own the experience. It is just as valuable as some of the paid roles that are out there. So really use that to leverage it into the next role that you might want.
And so someone has had great experience, which is really helpful, and you have to figure out how to package that up. And then a big part of that is the networking that you need to do. Clearly, you should be going out and beating the bushes. I would also argue a big part of it that a lot of people don't necessarily understand is you want to build a platform where you are seen as a person of authority. And whether that is speaking at conferences, writing books, being on podcasts, articles, whatever it might be. So for example, I know you run the Better Boards Conference and you were a speaker there. Having places where people see you and associate you and understand that this is the kind of person that you would be and you would bring in the value so they can see that to add you to a board. Maybe you can talk to us about either your personal experience doing that and how you grew and developed to that point where you are now requested to be a participant versus how you maybe say coach other people to go about it.
Your point about networks and presenting yourself is absolutely key. And in fact, I just did a review almost of the last 6 months of my podcast and of the themes that are developed there. And the number one theme is around relationships and building relationships and building those networks. It is absolutely key, I think, not just to a non-executive career, but indeed to an executive or any career. Like building those relationships is absolutely key. And I think being able to show yourself and wear that mantle of a non-executive director or board member is key. And indeed, I think that's one of the advantages you get from being on a not-for-profit board is you can then go to conferences, you can go to events as a non-executive director. It gives you that opportunity to participate in that space and, again, own that space. If you are going to an event for, in Australia, the Australian Institute of Company Directors or the Better Boards Conference or whatever it may be, you are there as a non-executive director, not in your professional role. So, again, I think something that I have done and something that I recommend others do is to kind of own that mantle and participate in those networks and at those events and at those conferences and in that space as a non-executive director. In terms of speaking at conferences, again, I have no doubt that anyone who is on a board, anyone will have gone through some sort of issue or challenge that will be of interest to others. So spending the time to think about what they might be and present them, whether it's as a blog post, whether it's a post on LinkedIn, talking about, some sort of challenge that you had, obviously maintaining confidentiality as needed, but maybe talking in generalities about some of the challenges that are shown, whether it's speaking at a conference. Those sorts of things are a really great way to showcase your thought leadership and your experience and your expertise around boards. So just getting out there and talking to people. One-on-one is great, but if you can talk to more than one, whether it's through blogs or LinkedIn or conferences, that's even better. But yeah, just showcasing your space, even thinking about LinkedIn, putting it in your headline on LinkedIn. I'm a non-executive director. No matter what organisation that is, showcase it, put it in your title so people know that that is part of your experience.
And certainly makes sense from a search engine optimization perspective. But I also wanted to double down on the point you were making of just being a NED in a nonprofit space really gives you access inside the club. Now you know the secret handshake and the code word because you can go to the conferences in the same way in the U.S. National Association of Corporate Directors is the big show here. You need to be a sitting director, but it can also be in a nonprofit. So you get to go there, rub elbows with everybody else who is eager to network and talk and hear and learn about each other. And that's where it starts. So putting yourself out there in the beginning, of course, you want to have done your homework and figure out your right pitch and the kind of people you want to talk to, but that's all part of the process. But there is nothing that duplicates the hard work that everybody's got to go and do it. I imagine part of your program is really just encouraging people, building them up, giving the support to get them out there because no one can do it for them, right?
Absolutely. If there's one thing that has been a clear message, both through the podcast and the events that I run where I get women speakers to come and speak, it's put your hand up. Just put yourself out there, put your hand up for these roles, be involved, put your hand up to go to the events, put your hand up to go to the conference, put your hand up to speak at the conference, put your hand up to write a blog about a particular issue that you've challenged. Put your hand up to be on a board role. Put your hand up once you're on the board to be on a different committee. Get in and put your hand up, and then put your hand up or put your hand down, as the case may be, to support others into it as well and provide that support and so on for others that might be newer to the journey as well.
Well, I feel like the time has blazed by today and we've covered so much. I would ask that the way we sum this up for our audience, if you look back at the experience that you've gone through and what you're seeing with your clients and people you're coaching, if you have to sort of pick out some of the lessons learned, often it's, I would have done this differently. We've talked about putting your hand up earlier as one example, but there's probably a lot of foot faults that people go through and they don't realize it till they look backwards. What is the kind of thing that you've seen hold back a lot of people that you give advice now of you could do it a little bit differently? And here's the way I think about it.
So a couple of things. One is put your hand up and get involved. But I think given networks and relationships are so key to this, what I often hear from people, I will say, go and talk to some other women that you know that are non-executive directors. Just go and have a coffee with them and find out what it's about. Or if you're particularly interested in organisation X and you know somebody that works there or who's on the board or who is on a committee, reach out to them and see what they have to say. And I often hear, oh, I couldn't do that. They don't have time to talk to me, or they're too important to talk to me, or they don't want to do that. And I just really encourage you to reach out. Reach out to these people, because 9 times out of 10, probably 99 times out of 100, they'll be really happy to hear from you. They'll be happy to hear, and they will be happy to give you their time, as long as, within reason. You go to them. If you want to do that, go to the local coffee shop near them, or perhaps do it via Zoom. Have some specific questions you want to talk to them about. But people are so happy to give their time. And indeed, when I have this conversation with the women that I deal with, I always say, well, what if you were reached out to? What if somebody came to you and said, look, I would love to talk to you about your experience or your organisation? And they all say, oh, no, I'd be very happy to do that. Well, of course you would. Just like the women you want to reach out to, we'll be happy to help you, and we'll be happy to provide that insight and support. And it helps you to build those networks and build your wisdom. So be brave, I would say. Be brave in reaching out to others to learn from them, and be brave in putting up your hand to take on some of these board roles.
I think that's great final advice for our audience, and it was just a delight to have you on the show today, Helga. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of our audience to be more boardroom bound.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to be part of it.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Helga Svendsen. It was wonderful to hear about the programs that she has built in Australia. So she has her board Kickstarter, which prepares people to land the first board seat, and then her board Accelerator program, which is once you're in that role, how do you be successful? How do you bring your best self to the boardroom? And although she's in Australia, this is a program done via Zoom, so you could be joining from anywhere in the world. The technology transcends all time boundaries. Now, I would encourage you to head over to podcast.gordon.edu, where you can get links to all of the resources that we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. And thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be boardroom bound.